Okay, welcome everybody. This is the first of a 5-part series, and I can honestly say I have rarely been so excited about what it is I'm going to be talking about, and I have rarely been as excited about the people who are here joining the Zoom. I recognize many of the names, and I am delighted and honored to have you here. I do not have COVID. I have this cough, but it's not going to kill me, at least not in the next hour. First of all, some credits, some acknowledgements. The music that you heard as you were in the waiting room area, composed by Patricia Julian, just wonderful stuff, specifically for the Endangered Alphabets. And today the engineer and producer is Alec Julian, no relative. He is going to be responsible for watching the chat and culling questions and comments and things so that I can focus on what I want to do, which is to talk to you. Anything else that I need to talk about beforehand? Yes, so this series of 5 talks, starting today, ending on the day before International Mother Language Day, very deliberately. One of the purposes, in fact, is to bring together the issues that are discussed by the endangered languages community and also script issues that obviously the Endangered Alphabets Project is primarily interested in, and to sort of reunite those as one set of concerns. And I hope that as long as I don't bore you to tears today, you'll spread the word and invite other people to come and join the future Zooms. Okay, I think that's about it for introduction stuff. Thanks to everybody who's already using the chat and saying hello to each other. And we've got people from all over the world, which is not only great, but also really important, as you will see. All right, I think we are pretty much ready to start. So take it away, Alec, and we'll get the slideshow going. Here we begin with, obvious question. You may think that the reason I bring this up is that I want to focus on the word writing, because after all, this series is called, what is writing? But actually, to start with, I want to focus on the word we. Because when I say we throughout this set of talks, I'm going to be talking about those of us in the privileged world, particularly in the West, and especially in Europe and North America. And the reason I'm so delighted we have so many people here who are not from this particular cohort is because we in the West, the we I'm talking about, are the ones who are accustomed to making pronouncements and writing definitions about writing. But we do so as a culture that is accustomed to using and learning only one script. In India, for example, a moderately educated person is likely to move back and forth between 3 or 4 scripts any given day. Their perspective is entirely different. If Indians dominated linguistics the way they dominate world cricket, some of our beliefs about scripts and writing would be very different. And you'll see what I mean shortly. Okay, so this is a quote from Thomas Carlyle in the mid to late 18th century. Certainly, the art of writing is the most miraculous of all things man has devised. And I love this quote because I love his enthusiasm. I love the way that he talks about writing as an art. But the fact is, this is really not the way most of us, and again, I'm using the us in the dominant culture West sense, think about writing. We don't think of it as being miraculous, and certainly not the most miraculous of all things. That would be, of course, the internet or the CD or the pencil. So one of the things that struck me when I first started working on the Endangered Alphabets is that I have been a writer most of my adult life, and I thought that I spent a lot of my time thinking about writing, and I certainly spent a lot of time thinking about how to use it effectively. But I certainly never thought, until I started working on the Endangered Alphabets, of writing as the most miraculous of all things man has devised. And I never really asked myself any really interesting questions about what writing is. So in the first of these 5 talks, I'm going to start answering the question, what is writing, by suggesting what it is not. And what writing is, or what I think writing is going to become increasingly clear, I hope, over the next 4 talks. So the first thing that writing is not, in fact, is what it is generally defined to be. And let's have a look at a couple of standard definitions. Writing is a means of using abstract visible symbols to represent the sounds of speech. This is really the standard kind of academic definition. And sometimes that is collapsed down to writing is visible speech, which is very interesting because it means that writing is at the beck and call of speech, and that speech is primary and writing is secondary. Next slide. And again, a definition, writing systems are not themselves human languages. They are means of rendering a language into a form that can be reconstructed by other humans separated by time and or space, etc. So I'm struck immediately by how defensive and how negative both of these definitions are. They're doing a lot to say what writing isn't. And next talk, we're going to talk about why it is that they're so defensive and why it is that these definitions seek in a way to marginalize writing itself, and certainly to demote it in significance. So, but the fact is, these definitions are not universal definitions, even though they sound authoritative. This is how writing is defined at a particular time in history by a particular set of people, namely in the 20th century by professional linguists in the West. So in my second talk, which is called Myths of Creation, Myths of Evolution, I'm going to go into much greater depth as to how this writing came to dominate others. For now, let's just think about how limiting this definition actually is. What it does is to turn our attention away from all kinds of really interesting questions that have been occurring to me since I started working on the Endangered Alphabets. For example, what is the value of writing? What is the purpose of writing? What should writing look like? We have certain assumptions about what writing is supposed to look like, and then, believe me, not universal. What is the relationship between writing and the history of ideas, the history of technology? What is the relationship between writing and geography? That's an interesting one we'll come to. Most importantly, for the purposes of International Mother Language Day, what is the relationship between writing and the culture that developed it, and the importance of it? And then what is the relationship between writing and art, between writing and thought, between writing and magic? So these questions are fascinating, and by no means all of the questions that have occurred to me. But I found myself thinking that it was very strange that there didn't seem to be lots of other people who were addressing such questions or doing so in sort of standard intellectual mainstream context. So for now, I just want to focus on one area. that shows that the significance of writing goes way beyond the ability simply to denote the sounds of speech. If all writing does is to help us notate what we say, then when a spoken language is no longer used, or when its speakers change to using a different set of symbols, then the old forms of writing should be useless and be discarded. But in fact, something very different happens. Next slide. So here we have banknotes, peso notes from the Philippines. And starting about 10 years ago, what began to happen is script was added to these notes in the traditional Baybayin script used for the Tagalog language. And it's not very easy to see, but it is right there on the right above the peso and on the lower left side. And this is a reminder that next time we do this, I will get larger photographs. You'll have to take my word. There's tiny letters there in the Baybayin script. Next one. Okay, this one you can actually see much more clearly. So this is the state official emblem of Mongolia. And not surprisingly, given the importance of the horse in Mongol culture, in the center of this emblem is a horse, actually a flying horse. But in the center of the horse is a letter. And this is a specific character, the Soyombo character from the Soyombo script, which was created some 350, 400 years ago by Zanabazar, who was a scholar and a poet and a Buddhist, a remarkable character. And the Soyombo script is really not in general use in Mongolia and hasn't been the primary script used in Mongolia ever, really. But one of its characters is at the heart of the horse, which is at the heart of the Mongolian emblem. So this is very interesting. What we're seeing here in both cases is a letter that has become a symbol for the people and their history and their cultural history, even though that letter is one that is not used in any way on a daily basis for representing speech. Next one. So here we have a sculpture. This is one of at least two sculpture parks in Croatia. And what makes these sculpture parks interesting is that each piece of sculpture, in this case, a rock or a stone, carries one of the letters of the Glagolitic alphabet. Now, the Glagolitic alphabet was created over 1,000 years ago and was used as a liturgical script for writing Church Slavonic in a number of the Slavic languages and states. But it hasn't been used for everyday purposes for a long time. It hasn't even been used for liturgical purposes, with the exception of a small number of priests who were still using it into the second half of the 20th century. And to all functional purposes, it is extinct, except that it clearly has such a kind of strong iconic meaning that this sculptor has created an entire walk based on using these letters as cultural and historic emblems. And in fact, I just read a paper that said there's actually something, a resurgence of sort of commercial use of glagolitic script in tourist trinkets, for example. And what that really says to us is that even though we, say, for example, I'm in Cork in Ireland, even though I cannot write and read in the Ogham script, and in fact, even though the Ogham script has not been fully deciphered and has probably not been regularly used for centuries, I still see those characters as being emblematic of myself, my country, my culture, my history. Next one. As someone pointed out in the chat, the Soyambo character is visible also on the Mongolian flag. And here we have the Amazia flag of the Amazia or Berber people of North Africa. And this, at the heart of this flag, is one of the letters of the Neo-Tifinagh script, the letter Yaz. And when this flag was being designed as part of the Amazia revival, which began in the mid to late 1960s and continues, and still continues up to the present day, that letter becomes central because what it says is that we have been here all along. It's a part of a script that's derived from scripts that are used on stones and stelae that you can find in museums in Morocco and Algeria that are 2,000 years old. And so when the Amazigh people are progressively marginalized over those 2,000 years by the Romans, by the Arabs, by the French, the fact that they can demonstrate through their writing that they have been here all along and that they have that kind of ancestral right to respect and to belong, you suddenly start seeing that for them, writing is a great deal more than a way to represent the sound of speech. And in fact, it remains that most Amazigh people in, for example, Morocco, do not read and write the Tifinagh script, although it's now being slowly reintroduced in schools. So the relationship between writing and culture suddenly becomes increasingly rich and important. And the last one, that noise was the dog making a kind of a grunting noise on the floor. So here is something I was just talking about. Oh, and this is utterly remarkable. This is a piece of public sculpture in Ogham. So as some of you may know, the Ogham script is really unusual because it's a series of branching lines off a central line. And so that makes it perfect to be emblematic for a tree or for the place where birds can perch. Those aren't real birds, by the way, those are sculpted birds. But this is actually, in a way, a statement of the importance of Irish language and tradition because it's in the grounds of, my Irish pronunciation is terrible, but Gaelscoil, I'm going to call it Gaelscoil, I'm almost certainly wrong. That's a school where the medium of instruction is Irish. So what we're seeing then in all of these is people, in some cases governments, in some cases ordinary people or artists, recognizing the iconic importance of writing in their culture, in their history, in their sense of who they are. Okay, let's move on. So if writing is just a series of abstract symbols, as we were told by that definition, that represent the sounds of speech, then why, when I do a carving in some minority script from around the world, I post it on social media and people get to me, and this is very common, and they respond, Thank you for showing our beautiful script. And this here is in Balinese. That word beautiful is extraordinarily powerful and deeply felt, very clearly. But to us in the West, it just seems strange. I mean, if someone put up a capital E in their garden as a sculpture, they would just be regarded as eccentric. But there's obviously something really going on here that frankly we are missing in terms of the importance of writing and its relationship with culture. And as I continued working on the endangered alphabets, I began to realize that something strange was going on under the surface. That is, under the surface of my beliefs and assumptions. And in fact, under the surface of pretty much everyone's beliefs and assumptions. And the very qualities that for me and perhaps for Carlyle made writing so fascinating were qualities that, according to conventional opinion, were not qualities of writing. Okay. So I am delighted to say that one of the people listening in is Philippa or Pippa Steele, and I'm going to quote from a couple of times from the introduction to a book that she co-wrote and co-edited, came out recently. And this is where we start asking the question, so why is it we believe, we in the West that is, believe what we do believe about writing? And so this is from the introduction. Research into writing was to a large extent defined as a field by Ignaz Gelb's seminal work, A Study of Writing. Gelb's so-called grammatology focuses on the analysis of the structural and formal elements of writing systems. In other words, it's very technical, and how these evolved historically from a logographic to an alphabetic form. I've highlighted that because we're going to talk about that a lot more in my next talk in a week's time. He essentially disregarded other aspects of writing practices, considering them to be a matter for other research areas. Well, here's the news. Those other research areas never happened, or maybe they're just starting to happen now. Okay. Next slide. Okay, so let's actually start thinking about those other areas that, by which writing might be considered. But to start with, we're going to move into the second thing that I'm going to say writing is not. And I must say that I owe some of my thoughts here to a conversation with Jerry Leonidas, who is the director of the postgraduate program in typography at the University of Reading, and is a specialist in non-Latin typography. So he has thought a great deal about the difference between Latin and non-Latin typography and the influence of printing on writing. So this statement, writing is not printing, is a sort of a really interesting statement, I think, because on the one hand, it's self-evident. Writing isn't printing, but on the other hand, it's controversial because so many of our attitudes in the West about writing are actually, whether we know it or not, about the printed version of writing, which I'm going to call printing. Writing is not printing, but for us, it generally is, although we don't stop and think about it that way. What most of us in the West don't take into account is that the Latin alphabet, which we are forever considering to be the only and best alphabet, is in fact the one that has been most influenced by the development of printing. And it's an interesting exercise if you are somewhere in Europe or North America or Australia, to spend a day just looking around at the stuff that you see that is written. And what you'll discover is that virtually none of it is written. Virtually all of it is printed. Our landscape, the one we consider as writing, is in fact almost entirely a landscape of printing. And it's interesting that when Carlyle wrote about, so enthusiastically about writing, although obviously printing had been invented, it was still very much a specialized form of writing. It wasn't used every day to the extent that it is now. Typewriters had been invented, but they didn't actually become popular and widespread until after his death. So when he said writing, what he had in mind, consciously or unconsciously, was far more likely to be writing by hand than when we use the word writing. So what difference does that make? All right, here we are, classic retro image, printing press. So what this means is that printing has affected our definition and understanding of writing. For example, printing makes us think about writing in industrial terms. We talk about a writer's productivity and output. The virtues of printing, though, are industrial virtues, the ability to be reproduced at volume, to be consistent or even identical from one copy to another, the ability to be delivered to a mass readership. More subtly, printing flattens writing. It changes its reflectivity. It changes its relationship with the substrate, in that printing is clearly sitting on top of the wood or the paper or the vinyl or whatever it's been printed on. Engraving in stone, like carving in wood, means that the stone and the wood interparticipate in the impact of the writing. They are both participants in what we take in when we read. This also means that as printing does not do that, printing celebrates the triumph of machine over nature and the triumph of machine over writing. Okay, next slide. So to see what I'm talking about, I'm going to take us to a grocery store in Seattle, where I was a couple of months ago. So in South Asia, where, as I've said before, writing means something very different to what it does in the West, there are several specifically mercantile scripts that are used specifically for keeping accounts or for writing about commercial matters. We in the West can't begin to understand that. We can't begin to understand, you have one script for this, but then when you're doing your accounting, you use a different script. But we have a faint echo of it. So when I was a kid and I was growing up in England, the greengrocer down the road would have little, signs tucked in amongst the fruit and veg to indicate the prices. And one of the things that was really interesting about that was that there was a kind of house style. Even though they were handwritten in a fashion that I would call grocery. Well, it's not a typeface, it's not a font, grocery style. So if you look on the right, that 2 and those 2 9s, that is exactly the style that was used by the greengrocers when I was growing up in England in the 50s and 60s. And when we look at these 2 signs, then what is really interesting is that the one on the right was clearly written by someone, and presumably, one of the people involved in actually selling you the oranges. And what that means is that, as I've put on the text here, handwriting is a kind of public self-introduction. These are someone's Mineola oranges, and if they're not delicious, we know who to complain to. If you look on the left, though, what you see is, of course, the opposite. Printing has a kind of anonymity, a sort of self-concealment, despite the fact that you can't really see this very well either. I need to make these images bigger. It says that this fruit is organic and it's local and it's grown in Washington State. What's really coming across here is the price and the barcode. And those make us realize that these pears could in fact be from anywhere and on sale anywhere. And the writer of the gung-ho promotional prose that is too small for you to read, we have no idea who that is. And we have no idea how to question their claims about these pears. Essentially, the writing here is an extension of the barcode. Printing then has this really interesting effect that it removes the writer. And everything changes in terms of what is writing when we bring the writer back in, when we stop thinking of writing as a product and we start thinking about it as an act. So this is something that I'm going to develop a great deal more in depth in my talk, Writing Beyond Writing, in a couple of weeks' time. But for now, I want to point out that writing is fundamentally different from speech in being inconvenient. So we all say, you know, I can't write fast enough to keep up with my brain and that kind of thing. And that actually turns out to be a really interesting quality of writing that, again, is distinct from that basic definition of representing the sound of speech. Because that, what I call the unit of resistance that's involved in writing, and of course, even more in carving, it slows us down. It forces us to think about what we want to say. It forces us to choose our words. We have to slow down from brain speed to hand speed. And as a result, writing becomes the opportunity for a kind of enforced inner journey. I know a poet and short story writer, for example, who, when the first PCs came out, he thought, great, I've always wanted to write a novel. I'm going to write this novel. And he sat down, he banged away at the novel, and he wrote it in 6 months. And he thought, this is fantastic. I would never have been able to do this, you know, on a typewriter or by pencil or whatever. And he sent the novel to his publisher, who called him down to Boston and took him out in a rowboat into the middle of a lake so they could be alone, and said, not only am I not going to publish your novel, I'm going to suggest you don't send it to anybody else. Because what has happened is that you have removed the unit of resistance. You have been able to write so fast that you were no longer thinking about your words in the way that you usually do, and in the way that makes your writing worth reading. So writing then, thanks to the fact that we write because we want to be understood over time and at distance by somebody who can't see our facial expressions or our body language, we pay more attention to how we express ourselves. In fact, the act of shaping our thought parallels the act of shaping our letters. So this is not just a conceit. Expressing the human mind through the human body. Okay, so we're now going to think about writing as a human physical act. Writing with our human body actually shapes the expression of our thoughts in some very particular ways. Writing is an act that incorporates and manifests the slightest movements in our hands, movements that are affected by our character, our mood, the temperature, the time of day, how much energy we have. We all write differently. If you notice, I tried writing the phrase, what is writing, 6 times, and every one of them is a little different. I was hasty at the beginning, and I managed to hit a stride, and then by the end, I was just getting silly. So the act of writing a letter is so sensitive that our arm and our wrist act as amplifiers of our entire physical gestalt, our being at any given time, until everything gets expressed in those tiny writing movements, and which become more full of telltale motions than the twitching of a lie detector. So here, what we see here straight away is that writing, and obviously this is something, it's a document from the University of Goa, it's in Sanskrit, written in the Devanagari script. But here what we see is that this is someone's writing. This isn't just writing, this is someone's writing. And even if we don't know who they are, they're clearly carrying out a human physical act, and they're showing application and dedication. That commitment brings value. So one of the things that I've learned through my carvings is that when you put that much time into something, people consciously or unconsciously recognize that. And it brings value and dignity and beauty because of that sense of purpose and intention. And by the way, this is true on the level of entire alphabets. So one of the really interesting things about the traditional Chinese and Arabic alphabets is that until they were simplified recently, they were clearly written. They were not typographic. You could see where the act of writing took place. They were a human act as opposed to a mechanical act. Next slide. And here is an even better example. So this is one of my carvings. Yes, this is a piece of Mongolian calligraphy. And obviously the wood is very nice, etc., etc. But the thing that makes this writing so remarkable is that you can see where the brush hits the page. You can see where it lifts and turns. You can see where one stroke is added to its predecessor. It shows that writing is not a product, but an act, almost a drama. It's a venture within and even against the forces of nature. So in that sense, all writing, unlike printing, takes place between two opposite poles. The need to create conventional, recognizable symbols that we call letters, and the opportunity to carry out conscious and unconscious acts of expression that are pretty damn close to what we think of as art. So finally, printing plays a role in confirming our belief that writing is nothing more than speech made visible. Okay, so we started out with that definition, writing is speech made visible. I kind of went, yeah, no, or that is a very limited understanding of writing. We then talked about printing, and in fact, the two come together here in a way that is really kind of sort of genius, I think, actually also totally by accident. But they come together, and they come together in a way in these two slides. So once you get outside the Latin writing world, writing is not thought of as speech made visible. It is often thought of as thought made visible. Now that is very, very different. Thought, as we know, is far more impulsive and creative and subjective than speech, where we're using conventional sounds and when we're sort of shaping those sounds with our mouths. So thought, making thought visible, and we're going to look at this a lot more in detail in my talk called Writing Beyond Writing. That runs counter to the industrial need of conveying information by reducing it to a minimal number of forms, each of which has as little variation as possible. So on the left, we have these Mayan glyphs, which are once again, beautiful. They're very expressive. We recognize all kinds of figures and images from the world. And they're carrying out a transmission of thought and meaning, but not necessarily doing so by reducing it to a set of symbols that represent the sounds of words. On the right, we see that that's what printing does. That's what it has to do. There are Unicode forms in which, say, for example, for the Yi language and script, there are thousands of symbols, but everyone acknowledges this is a pain in the butt. What printing promises and promised to do was to reduce everything to an industrial efficiency and to a minimum. And so everything is clear and simple. But what this does is to reduce the complexity of thought to the more limited expressiveness of speech, and then to represent speech in as few industrial, reusable moving parts as possible. And of course, the rise of coding more recently, in the last 30, 40 years, takes this assumption even further to the point where we not only confuse writing with printing, we confuse writing with coding. And we think of the purpose of writing as being to compress information or data and then make that available. Okay, so I'm now going to move away from the slideshow because I hate slideshows, I hate PowerPoint, etc. And normally I would just talk to you off the top of my head. But here's the thing. I thought so much about this that I had to write it down. And I'm actually going to read. I'm going to do that one eye here, one eye there thing where I read what I've written just so I can try and get it right. And then the other eye is going to go to the camera. And eventually I'm going to have a terrible headache. Okay, so writing then does convey information, but it conveys information in a far broader and more complex sense than what is normally meant by information or data. So for example, when we look at, and we're going to do this, when we look at symbol systems that use representations of the human face, take emojis, for example, they convey huge amounts of information, and they are able to do so very, very succinctly. Writing has decided, and we're going to talk about this next time, that it isn't going to go in that direction. And writing has moved further and further away from graphical representation until very recently. And in doing so, it has become more and more narrow. So I'm going to argue that the whole notion of writing being a set of abstract symbols could only occur to someone and could only be believed in a culture where, in fact, writing has become a set of generic symbols because of printing. And later on in this series of talks, I'm going to show you forms of writing that are anything but abstract. So this leads to my final point, which is that here's the other irony. As the world's dominant script culture, we users of the Latin alphabet are, in fact, the least qualified to talk about writing, because our script, the Latin alphabet, has one. So if we're Francophones, if we're Anglophones, we understand the importance of spoken language, and we identify very closely with it. We say, yes, yes, this is very, very important. But the fact is, we have no idea that people in the world have just as deep a connection to their script. And the reason is that, of course, our script is used by 3/4 of the countries in the world. And so for us, it just becomes Well, this is what writing is. It's like linguistic duct tape. It's what you do to jot down your grocery list or whatever. The notion that it could be much more than that doesn't occur to us because our writing has reached the point where that's all that it does, and we have the vanity to believe that is right. So it's almost impossible then for us to believe in the profoundness of the connection between a culture and its script, especially if that is the only culture that uses that script, especially if it's used it for centuries, to the point where it is a unique and distinct script from those around it. And it doesn't make any sense to us that there are cultures that put their script on pieces of public art or on banknotes or on their flags. Worst of all, and this is my absolute biggest pet peeve, is the assumption that the Latin alphabet is successful because it is superior. We're going to talk next week about why that is not true and how people came to believe that. But traveling out among the endangered alphabets has taught me something very different, which is that history is written by the winners, and it's written in the alphabet of the winners. The only reason why the Latin alphabet has become so dominant in the world is because at various crucial times, it had more lawyers, guns, and money than somebody else. But that's largely going to be the subject of my next talk, which is Myths of Creation, Myths of Evolution, where we're going to discover that there are cultures who realize Carlyle was right and realize that writing is so important, it actually becomes part of their mythic narrative of how the world was created, how humankind and their culture were created on an epic level. Okay, I'm going to take questions, comments, and abuse, etc. in just a second. But first, let's have this slide, Alec. Okay, here's the thing. We've just started a Kickstarter campaign, and the aim is for me to raise the funds to create a large public sculpture, not as big as the one in Ogham with the birds on it, but big, so that it really gives importance and drama to the scripts that are written on it. And one, in fact, I'm going to carve on it, not in Google Sans like this, but in more script, the right to speak, the right to read, the right to write. And those three scripts are the Osage script, from Oklahoma. In the middle is the Bamum script developed in the Cameroons in the early 20th century. Bottom right is the Mitimayak script. All three of these have at various times in their history been banned, or the users have been punished, or works have been burned in them. And they're illustrations of how important one's script is, but also how vulnerable it is at times of political and economic upheaval or war. So I want to make this big sculpture. I cannot afford to do it on my own. I've priced it out. I've priced the wood out. It's going to take me 4 months, etc. We're trying to raise $26,000. These talks are free, but I earnestly ask you to consider supporting our Kickstarter campaign. If everybody who subscribes to these talks and to our newsletter gave only $13, we would make our goal. So there's the link at the bottom. Alternatively, you can just go to kickstarter.com and type in Endangered Alphabets, and you'll find my several campaigns, especially the current one right here, and you can support it. And I would also really, really hope you would tell your friends and family about it, and other colleagues. Okay, and last thing I will say is that everybody who has participated in this Zoom talk. We will send you the link to the recorded version in an email along with the link to the next talk. Unless you think I'm completely full of crap, please talk up this series to, as I say, friends and colleagues. And now, at long last, I will take your questions and comments.
We have some very interesting chatter, philosophical chatter going on. I don't know if you want to go back into that and address some of it. I could.
Okay, so that mysterious voice you're hearing is our producer and engineer, and also the art director of the Endangered Alphabets and our web guru, Alec Julian.
Hi, everybody.
Yes. Okay. Yes. So should we do the hands up thing? Do you all know how to do the hands up? Getting my attention by at the bottom.
Do you want me to read through some of the comments first, or
sure? Why not? Why not?
So Marie wrote, very interesting, about
Marie O.
Yes, about the negative, so-called negative definitions.
Mm-hmm.
He says they're not negative; they're decolonial, which is a new word for me. Defending against colonial impositions and ideals that only languages, quote unquote, are written, and if there's no writing, then it's an inferior dialect. Most of the world's languages are not written, yet they are still languages.
So Marie is involved in a really, really interesting post-colonial enterprise involving the Sylheti people from Bangladesh. And that is a wonderful illustration of the relationship between power and language and writing. So everybody knows that British India, which covered much of what we now think of as South Asia, was profoundly affected by colonialism and, for example, by the introduction of the printing press by the British and by the British administrators' habit of playing favorites with the local community and saying, well, this is one tribe we can work with, and so we're gonna prefer those over all the others in this region. So there are many toxic things going on there. In Bangladesh, when Bangladesh achieved independence, one of the first acts that the government did, and this is in fact connected to International Mother Language Day, which is in fact based on the mother tongue movement for independence in Bangladesh, which was a movement to promote the use of indigenous Bengali languages over Urdu, which had become the official language while it was still part of the new nation of Pakistan. But when Bangladesh achieved independence, the government made Bangla or Bengali the official language and script, even though there were many indigenous languages and several indigenous scripts in the country. And so ever since, the Sylheti language and the Sylheti Nagri script have been substantially marginalized, and their users described as being backward, for example, because they are not speaking or writing in pure Bengali. So there you have a really interesting example of the kind of domino or repeated echo effects of colonialism. From my point of view, I am going to just keep on trying to promote the right of individual cultures to speak and write, or to develop or to revitalize their own traditional scripts. And I noticed that Bishwa had pointed out that Mite Mayak has now been revitalized to a point where it is now an official script in the Indian state of Manipur. So all of the three scripts that I've chosen to carve are interesting in that each of them embodies a degree of recovery from their history of marginalization and suppression. Okay, Alec, pick me another one.
All right. Still going through the old chat. There's some...
Alec actually has training in a degree in philosophy, so he is the right person to be looking through these comments.
Yes, this is very interesting. Some weirdo from Poland has some comment.
That's got to be Olish, right?
Yes. Says, I would disagree with printing influence in one specific genre, comic books, and perhaps logos. And I'll add graffiti is probably a great forum for that too.
Yes, and so one of the interesting things about all of those examples is how relatively recent they are, and how when you have the introduction of graffiti or comic books or manga into the printed form or emoji, then conservative voices immediately decry them and say, you are debasing literature. You are reducing our ability to be civilized people, because civilized people, of course, read and write in this very conventional New Times Roman fashion. Interestingly enough, as I was working on this set of talks, earlier, a conservative commentator came out and said, no grown man should use emoji. Emoji are for women and children. So clearly there is this sense, even in his comment there, that anything that has graphic or pictographic and symbolic significance is childish, which is exactly, of course, what the European explorers in Africa in the 19th century thought about local writing and symbol systems there. Okay, what else we got?
Anne responded to that by saying, I see perhaps a difference between printed text, i.e. a font, and a printed product of written text, i.e. hand-lettered comic or logo. Though there is still a difference between the printed comic and the handwritten draft.
Yes. And as one interesting sidestep on this, some cultures that are major and dominant cultures have still retained a strong sense of the importance of the written word. And one of them, of course, is Arabic. And as I understand it, the Nasdaq script, which is very traditional, very precise, very demanding, very ornate, very beautiful, is so closely associated with the word, with the truth, with kind of the spiritual rightness, that up until quite recently, even when newspapers began to be printed, the body copy was in printed Arabic, headline writers were still employed to write the headlines in Nasdaq. So it still retained that connection between the writing and the person and the spirit. Okay, what else we got?
We have Marie checking in again. Inca
Yes.
Kipu knots, I don't know if I'm mangling that, are encoding of thoughts, but it's not writing. Australian art, rock, and modern paintings and Pacific Island sand drawings aren't writing, but an encoding of story progressions, so thoughts but not writing. And this brings us back to emojis.
Yes, right. So I fully intend, so I, as you've already probably gathered, I totally respect Marie. And I understand what she's saying. I fully intend to be as subversive as possible so that by the end of this series, people hesitate before saying that's not writing. We may decide that there is a line between writing and symbolic representations of meaning. But for now, all I want to do is to blur that line just to get everyone thinking in different terms. And I ought to say at this point that another acknowledgement I want to give on this talk is to Michael Everson. So Michael Everson, some of you know him, absolutely one of the Hall of Fame, early Hall of Famers in the creation of fonts for non-Latin and minority scripts. And he has also taken it upon himself to be the voice of my conscience, because every so often I'll post a photograph of one of my carvings on social media and he will say, Tim, that's nice, but it's not writing. And so that led me to think a great deal about what is and is not writing. And as I say, for now, I do not want to spend any moment of my time saying this is not writing. I want to be raising questions about why we exclude certain things and why we define writing so narrowly.
And this dovetails perfectly with a comment from Pippa.
Oh, Pippa's with us. Great.
Personally, I've increasingly been shying away from defining what writing is to avoid shutting out a range of systems that may be difficult to describe linguistically, but that nevertheless have demonstrably systematic links between signs, shapes, images, and meanings.
So Pippa is a paleographer and part of the Cruise project out of Cambridge, and was also one of the people whose introduction I quoted earlier in the talk. She and I are going to be talking sometime in the next week or two, because we're starting to sense that there may well be similar issues and questions raised by studying paleographic systems and studying contemporary marginalized or endangered systems. And as a third possibility, newly created systems where somebody has invented a new script system for their culture. And we're going to be talking about that in the talk that I'm going to give called Script Death, Script Birth, I believe.
Note here from Wale, I'm sorry if I'm butchering your name. There's a traditional means of sending messages among the Yoruba in Nigeria. Yeah. It's called Aroku, semiotic codes. It uses objects like cowries, native combs, etc. Can we regard this as a script too?
So while we're broadening our range of indigenous media used for conveying information, right where I live, which is right up by Lake Champlain up towards the Canadian border, one of the things that the ancestral people of this region, the Abenaki, did, and a number of other native peoples did, was to bend trees. They would take a young tree and bind it in such a way that as it grew up, it would have a particular shape, which would convey, and this would be a tree by one of their regularly traveled footpaths, and that would convey meaning to any other Abenaki who are coming along that trail. So yeah, we are busting Pandora's box way open here.
Shall I keep going?
Yeah, why not?
All right. Gonzalo, thank you, Tim, for this interesting presentation.
Hey, Gonzalo.
Maybe a comment why linguists have been disregarding so much the writing so far.
And we are going to talk about that next week, next Sunday. This is as good as you're going to get in terms of a cliffhanger. Yes. I'm going to give a talk called Myths of Creation, Myths of Evolution. And again, actually, I'm probably going to be quoting Pippa and her colleagues, but a number of other people as well. And shout out, as always, to Piers Kelly, who I don't think is with us. Piers is one of the, I think of him as the Indiana Jones of linguistic anthropology. He's one of the very, very few people in the world who actually goes out into the field to study indigenous writing systems. And quite a few of my ideas have been stolen from him, so I feel it's only fair to acknowledge him. Let's take one more question.
Oh, how to choose. Well, I'll do 2 for 1. Just a quick comment from Marie. We may want to be careful using such a large inclusion of non-language in writing, because that supports the idea that a universal language would be best, so we don't need to support language diversity.
Ooh. Oh, no, let's not go there. Okay. And what's the other part?
And then Andres, despite the wider definition Tim is giving, I recently analyzed the emojis in more traditional saussure terms. And I believe emojis fit very well. Sadly, it's written in Spanish. Maybe he can translate.
Yes, actually, Saussure is gonna turn up next week as well. And I love the idea that somebody is doing linguistic analysis of emoji, precisely because if you think about all of the specific subfields in linguistics, which are mostly, if not almost entirely, devoted to spoken language, then I am putting in a pitch for the study and focus on writing systems, and many of the sort of writing questions that I brought up today, and many more. I would love to see, subspecialties, conferences in the physical act of writing, the physics of writing. If you're interested, I'll talk some other time about the physics of writing. Yes, we are just beginning to open this field up, and I am delighted to have you all with me here to keep me on the straight and narrow, because after all, this is all stuff that I'm making up as I'm going along. I am not a linguist. I don't even play one on TV. I'm an essayist, and this is just stuff that occurs to me as I am trying to carve a piece of wood. Anyhow, please, please, please support our Kickstarter and get the word out around that. I promise I will send you the link to the video recording of today's event, and the link to next week's. I hope to hear from you and see you all next Sunday, but don't wait till then. You can email me through endangeredalphabets.com, and we can set up Zooms and chat. This is how I learn about what's going on. It may seem as if I'm teaching. I am stumbling. Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us, and I hope to see you all again soon.